Hi everyone.
Hello.
Thanks. Thanks for joining this conversation. I'm going to assume that everybody is here and go ahead if that's all right. So I briefly want to share with you my experience of new monasticism and also learning to share life with people. And then afterwards I'll open it up to discussion. And it would be good to hear any of your reflections on where you've built life with people and where that has been worked well, or where perhaps that has been difficult. I will remind you though that we're recording this session as well, so just be mindful of what you say. So new monasticism is a name that works well with people outside of the church. However, I found in church circles that talking about new monasticism can conjure up this idea of people being overly pious and perhaps a bit exclusive. This kind of thinking, I've discovered that it's quite difficult to get past. So I don't really care about defending the words new monasticism. To me, it's not a battle I personally care to have. My passion for new monasticism didn't come about because I was passionate about monasticism. It came from a genuine desire to find a way of being church that looked more like Acts 2 and Acts 4. I was inspired by the way the earliest disciples of Jesus kept his teaching alive, were committed to one another, met in one another's homes, shared meals, and pooled their resources to meet needs. And I started looking for that kind of community where we could share life together and have real camaraderie. The second thing I was looking for was discipleship. Through my reading of the Gospels, I could see that when Jesus proclaimed the immediacy of God's kingdom, he was asking for a whole person response. He was not looking just to be worshipped, but followed, not just believed in, but he was looking for people who would put what he said into practice. And one of the things he said was, repent and believe the good news. I started to realize that meant dream up your whole life again, because there's a new way to live and a new way to be human. And those who first heard his message began making drastic changes to their lives based on his instructions. For example, after Jesus had taught his disciples to sell their possessions and give to the poor in Luke 12, we find the disciples doing just that in Acts 2. Together they created this shared culture and a community of practice where whole life transformation was expected. If I'm honest, my faith growing up didn't look much like this whole life transformation. Its focus was on moral purity before I die. The kingdom of God was simply another way of saying heaven. It was just something we are to hope for when we die, rather than being something we are to bear witness to here on earth. It was emphasized by my church that the earth is not my home, and therefore not overly my concern. However, the practice of my family whilst I was growing up helped point me to a Jesus who had a whole lot more to say about how we live on earth and how we make a real difference in the here and now. When I was growing up, there were times at our house when it was a bit of a free-for-all. I remember being a kid sitting on a homeless guy's lap who used to visit our house, and he taught me card tricks. Another regular visitor at the house, I remember sitting in our lounge talking about how he ran faster than a car and how he jumped over a house to get to our house. I now realise he was high as a kite, but at the time I was baffled as to how an adult could expect me, a kid, to believe that. I remember Mum emptying the kitchen cupboards to people that they had recently helped house. The large amount of young people that they cared for at the youth centre. The phone ringing as Mum took the time to listen and empathise with people. I remember them letting me give my ice cream to a homeless guy who grumpily turned my offer down. This was my first glimpse that compassion and its application can be complicated. Although my parents' theology might be somewhat different to mine now, they showed me more about Jesus by how they lived than what they said, and I was fascinated by him. I could see that my parents were following Jesus, who had taught them to love their neighbour, to include the excluded, to share food with the hungry, to not be judgmental, to forgive others even when they screw you over. I could see that following Jesus involved learning to love others as God loves. Following in the way of Jesus is not easy, and we need one another to help us. So new monasticism is just one way that I think that can be achieved. New monasticism is where a group of people commit to sharing life together, creating shared practices and rhythms inspired by the life and teaching of Jesus in order to build a common life together. Each week might look like making time to share meals together, praying or meditating together, hanging out together, growing food. For some groups, it means moving in together. It also means having a mission above and beyond the immediate community, particularly including those in the community that might easily be overlooked. For example, it could be that there's an old folks home in a community, and some of those folks never have family or visitors. The new monastic community might consider how they could include them in their community. It could be that they run weekly meals and board games for people living in supported accommodation hostels. They could arrange picnics for people from a mental health unit. They could run a hospitality house on a council estate. So for us in Restore, which used to be called OpShops, and it's important to say that we're just at the very start of this, but for us it looks like meeting regularly for morning prayer and sharing meals together, sometimes in our charity shops, sometimes at our house. At morning prayer and the meals, we'll talk and pray through one of our practices each week. And the practices that we're trying to build community and shape our lives around are hospitality, simplicity, peace, resistance, and prayer. The charity shops are purposely placed in areas of need. We run men in sheds and a community allotment, which builds friendships with people, some of whom struggle with mental health and addiction, some who have recently come out of prison or are in the local hostel. It's important to say that Men in Sheds isn't just some sort of charity thing. When I moved up to Carlisle, I didn't know anyone, and the people I met through the projects, they became my community and my friends. We hang out together and the help has been mutual. I just want to, before I open it up to conversation, I just want to finish by saying, in our culture, independence is seen as a really high value. The problem is that the scriptures don't really teach us about independence. They teach us more about interdependence, this kind of need of one another, this idea of community over independence. So even in our culture, our architecture is built around individual families rather than community. But then you look at cultures around the world where they have living spaces that are small, but they're built around a common space where people eat, dance, sing, and tell stories together. And I absolutely love that image of life, because I believe God has created us for community, to love and to be loved. So the invitation is to think further and to create a common life with others. So I'm just going to open this up to conversation. So if you have a comment on what I've said, or if you want to share an experience of building common life with people, then take yourself off mute and you can speak.
Everybody. Sorry.
Yeah.
Chris, it's Steve Amelia from the Salvation Army in Carlisle, mate. It's lovely to hear a southern accent in the midst of all these northern types. But it is, no offence, my brothers and sisters, honestly. I was just wondering, have you read Gary Bishop's work, Darkest England and the Way Back In, which was a study that he and the project at Openshaw did, when was it? Early 2000s. Mel and I went there to study the work before we became officers, and basically what you're talking about is exactly what we saw. It is about being in and so much coming alongside them. And one of the things I was particularly interested in at the time is that they were set up, Gary set that lot up simply to look out for the kids, the tens and ups, I think, to about teens. But when I was talking to him about Sam Ward, who was the project leader at the time Gary had left, I said, how are you managing to separate that from the rest of it? So in other words, minister solely to a group. And he came straight back to me and said, Steve, the truth of it is, mate, he said, you can't look at one group without looking at all groups. So while we're looking at the kids, we're ministering to mums and dads, aunts and uncles, nans and granddads. How are you seeing that in your work up here in Carlisle, mate?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have read that book, and I think it's brilliant. And I also went up to meet with Gary after reading it to see what they were doing in Openshaw, and it was fascinating. I think the thing that I really resonated with it was this commitment to, as they would say, the last, the least, and the lost. So the people that are sort of being abandoned and sort of left, and how the imperative of the gospel is to go find them. It's not to tell those on the margins to come and find the church, but it's to tell the church to go find those on the margins, which is what I really related to. So here, I guess similar, I started out as a detached youth worker, and I started addressing the needs of young people on the street. But after a while, you sort of realize you're with them for a small amount of time, and then you're sending them back home into environments that are less than ideal often. So I think that's when you start seeing how everything's connected, and you want to start addressing some of the other issues and family members as well. It's been interesting doing it this way around. So now I mainly work with adults and people with sort of mental health and addiction issues. So yes, it's a kind of different experience, because they're obviously there's still like a wider framework of what causes their problems. So it's just to be mindful of that as well, I think.
Chris, it's Lee here.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, how you doing?
Not too bad.
It's great. It's great that you're in the glorious north, no matter what Steve says there. We love Northerners. Oh, we love Southerners as well. Chris, it's the work you're doing is fantastic, and we're delighted that you came up here. Can you just tell us something about how you keep yourself safe and your family safe in the midst of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's really difficult, because like obviously my experience of growing up was unusual. So I was quite used to having homeless people come into the house, and sort of things happened. There were some things I saw that probably wasn't very good. But ultimately the thing I remember is the love of my parents towards other people, and that sort of, and so for my kids, I'm worried. You obviously worry for their safety. That's one thing you worry about. But I also worry, that my kids would grow up and then see a homeless person on the street and see them as other rather than as a human being. So trying to get that balance right is tricky. We have a risk assessment for the house, so we have certain rules that we have. There's lots of people that we sort of have at our house that have criminal records and have been in prison and stuff like that. Some of those people I'm perfectly happy being around my kids. There's other people that we've talked to, and it's not appropriate for them to come to our house, but I still work with them where I can. And we kind of see it as a family thing. So we used to run a meal for the homeless and for the church to kind of meet each other. And we found that the kids were the best people. So there was like a homeless guy who really didn't like relating to people and didn't talk to anyone, would some sort of grumpily sit on his own and wouldn't engage with everyone. And then I saw one of my kids just go and plonk like Connect 4 in front of him and sort of forced him almost to start playing Connect 4. And we were all sort of like watching out the corners of our eye, and then you started seeing him playing with one of my kids Connect 4, and it was like a beautiful thing.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great response. You'd expect me to ask that question as an archdeacon.
Oh yeah.
Chris, could I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
You mentioned really briefly about your values, peace, hospitality. I'm going to let simplicity, prayer, resistance.
Yeah.
Where can people? I've read these things, so it's a bit. I'm not here as a plant, but just to say, I really valued reading sort of in more depth about those. So do you want to just sort of highlight where people can find out more about those values?
Yeah. So
they really help me in reflecting what I do in my practice. You know, in terms of volunteering and that sort of stuff. So yeah.
Brilliant. So on the God for All site, I've written short booklets on hospitality, simplicity, peace, resistance, and prayer. And they share sort of personal stories, but also how we're looking to live out those values. So I think if you go to the God for All site, you can download them. Yeah.
Chris, it's Christy here.
Hiya.
Hi. How have you found the COVID-19 situation has affected what you do?
Yeah, in short, it's been a nightmare. Mainly, like for me personally, I quite enjoyed the first bit of it because I was sort of with the crowd of people who said, "Oh, it's great that we can slow down and we can sort of take our time and we can listen and stuff like that." And I found that was good for about 2 weeks, and then I was sort of climbing up the walls and wanting to do something. And then at the same time, you're hearing about how, you know, domestic violence rates have gone up and mental people suffering with thoughts of suicide and stuff like that. And so you sort of want to get stuck in again. So where possible, we've managed to change our groups and keep everybody that was involved before. But it means that we've had less time because we've had to put on more groups to work with just the same amount of people that we were working before. So that's been tricky. We've done some stuff. We've moved online with our sort of prayer meetings and stuff like that. So I phone everybody in the morning and then we all join together online. And that's actually been a really good way of doing things.
Have you managed to eat together?
Yeah, we've just started doing that again. So, but it's really there's no ideal, like so we're not finding this. So we can have 6 people eating together, spaced out. But then we have some people join us online, and like we thought about trying to deliver them food so they can eat the same thing. But I mean it's all like a second best. It's tricky.
My question is that you're working outside the inherited model of church. So for those of us that are running parishes with all that entails, what advice would you give? Because how do we start to learn and maybe model some of those ideas of building community when we've got the structure of church and everything else to deal with as well? Which might inhibit that.
Yeah. In one sense, I might not be the best person to answer that question, but for me, it's I think things like, as other people said, things tend to get so complicated, and we pile up activities and programs and stuff like this to cater for everyone. I think there is a place for being more simple and realizing we're one family. So how do we create time in the week to be together, to do things together and spend time hanging out? How do we build a rhythm into our church life which reminds people it's every single day? So like morning prayer is a brilliant one that most churches I guess do already. How people can see that as an important part of being together. And trying to move away from this church is an event, church happens on a certain time on a certain day, to how does church happen throughout the week? How are we? I think that's what I'd say.
Chris, I was just wanting to say thank you because I was really inspired by and challenged by your comment, which challenges us as church, I think, where you're talking about being a community of both believers and non-believers or not yet believers, journeying and doing life together, and through that journey growing into a community of believers and of church. And I think that's just a real invitation and challenge for us as Christians who are in our community of churches, which often is there will be church and we'll go out to the non-believers and offer something. And so there's an us and them mentality that happens within that. And so I suppose it's kind of a reflection on Simon's question as well, which is what are we willing to release from our churches, or who are we willing to release from our churches to be church in different places to people who are not yet believers, and how long are we willing to do that journey and reflect on what that journey looks like, whether it includes our recognised milestones that we like to see in church or not, or whether those milestones look differently. So you talked a lot about the changes you saw within people by them being in this community which is focused around Christ. That might not look like a baptism or an alpha course, but it might look like patience or forgiveness or community. So I'm just really inspired by all of that. It just really gets me thinking about my own practices in my time-honoured church setting, and actually how effective am I being in my mission and ministry. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that I think when we think about who do we have influence over, it's normally the people that we spend time with. So I think creating environments where we're actually spending a lot of time with people who aren't Christians is probably a healthy thing. Obviously, like for us, like at Men in Sheds is the best example I have of that, where it's just a bunch of people who all admit that we haven't got all of our stuff together. We all struggle with mental health or things in different way. And it's become a really supportive community where people feel able to share their struggles. And I've seen over time that other people, it's not just me sort of picking up on people when they're not there, or people that are struggling. It's other guys in the group are checking on one another. So I think, and so you could say there's early signs of discipleship there. There's early signs of people starting not just to think about themselves, but to think of others, learning how to show compassion. And obviously that's where a lot of healing comes, is actually when we don't look at ourselves, but we look to be of use to other people as well.
Chris, unless somebody else, we've only got a few minutes left, unless somebody else wants to jump in, can I just draw your attention to Johnny and Kat's comment in the chat about taking culture in, and that, if you can see it, and also ask, though, to what degree is new monasticism about taking culture in, or is the culture itself formed by the context, so it's contextual? Are you able just to respond in the last couple of minutes? Thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose there's different ways, isn't there? There's like imported models of new monastic communities that are there. I suppose what we're trying to do in Carlisle is work with the people that are coming to us and finding out appropriate ways of responding. So finding rhythms of life that don't just work for me, but work for the people that we're working with. And what do the practices mean? So hospitality, simplicity, peace, resistance, prayer. They didn't actually come from the community. They're ones that I've sort of brought to the community. But I think through conversation, they may change over time to be more relevant to the group. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or, yeah. Excellent. I don't know if I have to send us back into the other room or no. Okay.
I think they'll do it when it's time. Very quick comment on Simon's question. I just think I'm really excited by the fact that there's a rule of life as part of the Vision Refresh. And I think that's corporate as well as individual. So hopefully that will help those of us who are more in the sort of inherited church model to develop some of those sort of perhaps root monastic core values in the way we think and the way we operate. I think that's really positive. It might be a bit of a blending, if you like, between thinking of new monasticism as something completely different from us. Actually, it's not. I think perhaps it will bring us a bit closer together.
Yeah. And I think it's really exciting that it's quite a broad vision. So it includes sort of caring for the environment and speaking boldly about faith, because I think they all go hand in hand. It's sort of certainly what I've experienced is when people see that you're caring about the planet, you're caring about individual people's needs, they can start to see that faith really does speak into their situations, and sharing faith becomes just a natural part of life, I think. Yeah. Any more questions before we're hoofed out?
I just thank you very much, Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.